Dr. Leon Schreiber is the Shadow Minister of Public Service and Administration with the Democratic Alliance. He's the man who is being, hunting the ANC so that it gives the inside details on Cadre Deployment, one of the most destructive policies that South Africa's had to deal with over the past 30 years. I guess this is a follow-up to the last conversation that we had, Leon. At that time, I hadn't had a chance to have a look at all the details of the Cadre Deployment information, the documentation that was handed over to you because the court told the ANC it had to. I think you told us that day that it had taken something like 3 years to get to that point. But when we then looked at the information, a heck of a lot of it had actually been what they call redacted. In other words, you didn't know who the people were. There was a lot of stuff in there that needed, that if you wanted to get the full picture, it would have been much better to know what it was before someone took a koki-pen to it. And so you didn't let it rest.
No, indeed, Alec, it's good to be with you again. And I remember from our previous conversation that we even issued a bit of a public invitation to people to help us go through it and see if they could identify, some of the most egregious cases. But in the event, as you say, that was very difficult because every single name in the 1,300 pages of documents had been redacted, as well as some other information that made it really very difficult to use it in any meaningful way. So that was one of the things that was back before the Joburg High Court yesterday. But that wasn't the only issue that we pointed out to the court in our application to hold the ANC and Fikile Mbalula specifically in contempt. So that was one of it, and the court agreed with us that it was unlawful for the ANC to redact these documents when the court order had been explicit that all information must be made public. But the second thing was that the court actually also held that the ANC had illegally destroyed some of the information because the party admitted through an affidavit from Mr. Mbalula that it had deleted emails from the Cadre Deployment Committee after the court order had been issued, the original one in the Joburg High Court back in 2021. And then thirdly, and very importantly, the court also agreed with us that it was unlawful for the ANC to withhold certain kinds of information. And it very explicitly mentions President Cyril Ramaphosa in this regard, saying that he was the chairman of this committee, and therefore his emails, his WhatsApps, his correspondence containing information related to his work as chairman of the deployment committee should also have been included, as well as the other members of the committee and government officials who were essentially receiving these instructions from the ANC's deployment committee. So it was really a 6-love victory for the DA. I mean, it was devastating analysis of the ANC's dishonesty. And on the basis of that, the court then concludes that the ANC willfully and with mala fides acted in contempt of court. And now we have a situation for the first time in 30 years of our democracy that the governing party of this country is in contempt of an order that was issued and upheld by the Constitutional Court. And that's why we are calling on Ramaphosa specifically as well as president of the country to now comply with this ruling, because if he doesn't and the ANC continues to basically ignore the Constitutional Court, then we are going to move towards the territory of a constitutional crisis. And I think that tells you all about the ANC's desperation to hide whatever's in Ramaphosa's minutes and correspondence.
All of this is in a civilized society, in a constitutional democracy, should not be allowed, and we know that. But we also know that this is dynamite information, which we thought it would all be available. The BizNews community, many people put their hands up, went through the documentation, then came back and said, but there's nothing, we can't find it's almost like the smoking gun, which should be here, but isn't here. Are you surprised, though, that the ANC has done what it's done? And perhaps you can, because I don't think members of the public are surprised, and perhaps you can take us to the next step. What if in the next 15 days they do not comply with what the court has told them to?
Yes, I think it's a comment on the ANC that no one is really surprised that they would be willing to subvert the rule of law in order to hide, I think very quite specifically, Ramaphosa's involvement. And I think we must emphasize this because whatever they gave us, even in redacted form, was all from the period after 2018. So you can see that the ANC very deliberately excluded anything from 2013 until 2018. There is not a single piece of documentation, not a WhatsApp, not an email, not a meeting minute, not a note from that period. So that only should heighten our concern over the president, the current sitting president's role in a practice that the Zondo Commission told us facilitated state capture. So I think that is the only logical explanation for why the ANC would be this desperate and willing to actually go this far in undermining the rule of law. Now, what the judge said yesterday, as you point out, is that the ANC has 15 working days to compile all of this unredacted information, but also then, of course, to get a hold of Mr. Ramaphosa's emails, WhatsApps, and additional information from committee members. But there's a critical component of this court order that I think might be the most important of all. And that is that the judge has said that the ANC must provide hard drives and laptops from the officials who admitted under oath that they are the ones who keep record to an independent IT expert selected by the DA. And if we can get that executed, in other words, the raw source material, the hard drives, the deleted emails, whatever they claim, I am quite confident that the expertise exists for us to extract that information. So I think if I look at this court order and I look at how desperate the ANC is not to comply with it, that is probably their biggest nightmare, because we all know that that kind of information can be retrieved. So I think that is quite important. However, it may still be that the ANC also defies this particular court order, because it's now no longer a theoretical exercise. The ANC is in contempt of court. At the moment, it is a civil case. We have approached the court for a civil contempt of court case. But as you know, Alec, the next step is criminal contempt of court. And it's basically the last mechanism that the legal system has at its disposal when people, organizations refuse to comply with a court order, and it results in imprisonment for the relevant officials. And that would certainly include Fikile Mbalula, but possibly others involved in holding the court in contempt. So I must say, a lot of people said to me, and I think even when we discussed it last time, I said to you that I am somewhat, taken aback by the number of people who say they'll never hand it over. But I must say to you, we have never been naive in this process. And I think the only reason we've gotten this far is because we've always planned for the ANC to be as dishonest as possible. And so that's why I can say to you, we are already preparing for the next step. As we've done over the last, it's now approaching 4 years of work on this, we are preparing for a scenario where the ANC undermines a contempt judgment. And then we would certainly be using every tool at our disposal to send the officials to prison, because that is the last remedy.
For those who've been following the story, all of what you've said now makes perfect sense. But what about those people who are jumping in for the first time and saying, contempt of court, it doesn't sound like anything terribly serious. What exactly do we know from the documentation that you already have at your disposal?
Yes, so I think it's just important, it's a great question, to go back to what this is all about, why we are pursuing this. It's on two levels, Alec. The first one is the Zondo Commission told us that Cadre Deployment facilitated state capture. So in order for us to hold accountable the correct people who facilitated state capture, we need to understand the details of Cadre Deployment. So as much as the ANC would like to tell us that the Zondo Commission has finished its work, it spent R1 billion of taxpayer money, and now we must move on, that's never going to happen. We cannot move on until we understand how this practice was facilitated. And what I've said all along is the trick to understanding state capture is to understand how those people who captured the state were appointed in the first place. If you look at a Hlaudi Motsoeneng, you look at a Dudu Myeni, Arthur Fraser, all these names that we are familiar with, how on earth could they go through a selection process that was fair and merit-based and be appointed? The answer is they can't. It had to be manipulated from the outside, and the tool that did that is Cadre Deployment. So we are not anywhere close to done with state capture until we find the fingerprints of the people involved in Cadre Deployment. That's really the first fundamental issue. But secondly, beyond just state capture, I think the documentation that we do have at our disposal, and also some of the very limited set of minutes that the Zondo Commission obtained, and which we as the DA subsequently got hold of through a promotion of access to information request, demonstrates to us that cadre deployment is the root cause of state failure. So it's not only about corruption and state capture, but it is also about state failure. Because if you look at the limited information that is available, you can see that in a short period of time, the National Deployment Committee of the ANC interfered with 85 different government departments and institutions. It interferes with appointments all the way down to middle management, and it interferes with Chapter 9 institutions and even the courts. And in many cases, you can see that there are specific references to a particular person being a cadre of the ANC, a loyal comrade of the ANC, and essentially reducing the appointment decision to what benefits the governing party rather than who can actually do the job. Now, the terrifying thing about all of this is that cadre deployment is not only limited to the national government level. The minutes themselves refer to the ANC's provincial as well as regional deployment committees. So this means that from the highest level all the way down to municipalities, the ANC subverts appointment processes and ensures that cadres are appointed. I mean, the number of cases, I'll give you one example in Limpopo province, of a municipal manager who is implicated in the VBS scandal, who was removed from that position, and lo and behold, a few months ago, was appointed as municipal manager at another municipality in Limpopo. And then we ask ourselves why Limpopo doesn't have water, why the roads are falling apart. So the two-pronged answer is, if we want to bring an end to state capture and corruption, we need to hold accountable the people involved in cadre deployment. But also, if we want to fix the state, we need to bring an end to this practice. And that's where transparency is vital on both fronts.
It's quite extraordinary, actually, when you sit back and think we've got an election and we've still got people who say, no, we'll vote for this party because they were the party that rescued the country from apartheid. But I suppose it was a little bit like, from the frying pan into the fire. It certainly appears to be that way, given the way the economy has performed. The big issue here, though, is that there's lots of talk about after the election, a government of national unity, which will be headed by Cyril Ramaphosa. Nobody else the DA would be suitable for the DA to even consider it. Going after him in this way, in this deliberate manner, is that not putting that possibility of averting what John Steenhuisen said at our conference, the doomsday coalition, does that not just completely wipe that possibility out?
Well, I think we're leaving off the table there the most important solution, or the most viable solution for South Africa, which is the multi-party charter. And it's only if you accept defeat or accept this sort of second or third or fourth worst outcome that you would lose sight of this. And I think that this particular matter, as well as, and as I said earlier, it is, any logical person can see that this is a cover-up by the ANC to keep Ramaphosa's fingerprints off cadre deployment and subsequently then off state capture, and that they are absolutely willing to go to any lengths to do that. So I do think, let's talk straightly to each other as well, Alec. We've got now less than 2 months to go to an election. I think it is vital for the people of South Africa, and it's actually a point we made in our court papers, that the people of South Africa need to know if the current president was involved in facilitating state capture, as the Zondo Commission termed the practice of cadre deployment. That is a fundamental issue about transparency and actually about informing the electorate. So this matter in the current environment, I do want to just stress, this didn't start yesterday. And there are people who say, oh, the DA, is playing politics. Well, then we've been playing politics for years and even decades on this matter. I personally have been driving it since coming to Parliament in 2019 with exactly the same focus that I'm doing now. But the truth is, of course, that now we are very close to an election. And, I do believe fundamentally that if South Africans were to actually see the truth about the person who promised them the new dawn and all these, the bullet trains and the smart cities and all these things that have turned out to be lies, to see that he was certainly no innocent bystander, but was actually the chairman of the process that facilitated the very destruction of the state that the ANC now, claims to want to address, that could have very substantial political implications. And I think that in that sense, we should also look at this politically as a vital fight for the promotion of the multi-party charter, the alternative. Because at the end of the day, if we are able to demonstrate what we strongly believe, which is that the ANC, through Mr. Ramaphosa, was no innocent bystander, was keenly involved with the state capture project, that we would in that way be able to inflict a very serious political blow close to the election to the ANC as well. That doesn't mean we will let this go after the election. It doesn't mean that all the work we've done previously is less important. But of course, your question is informed by the current context. And I think that we must play for first prize. And I don't think anyone would disagree that first prize remains, that we get rid of the ANC and that we get the multi-party charter across the line. And I'm doing my bit through this work.
It's quite extraordinary, really, if you just sit back for a while, because Cyril Ramaphosa has been outspoken against state capture, but perhaps he might have felt that the people that he was putting into these positions were people who were going to do a good job, because that's the only rational explanation. But once they got there, clearly, as we know from the record and we know what's happened in the country, they didn't do a good job. Was there anything in the documentation that you've seen where the Cadre Deployment Committee reversed any of the decisions, pulled back, recalled, as they like doing with their presidents, some of those cadres who'd been deployed and had made, feathered their own nests rather than supporting the country?
Well, again, I mean, the problem right now is that everything we have is from the post-Ramaphosa, from the post-Zuma periods, so post-Ramaphosa's chairmanship of the committee. So at the moment, we just can't say, and that's why yesterday's judgment is important. But certainly judging from the limited information we have from the period after that, from 2018 to 2021, we can see that there is extensive consideration of how to redeploy. And that's a term that many South Africans are also familiar with, because in fact, there's a database, an internal database with hundreds of names of cadres for consideration is the title of the database. And that this database is then used to essentially find people. I mean, one who comes to mind, I think there's the former mayor of eThekwini who was, unceremoniously removed, but then finds their way back onto this database. And then the party indeed actively looks for opportunities to redeploy this person. So in other words, to find a job for them, regardless of whether they may be the best candidate, but because, they are the person. I think one of the good ways to think about this is that the ANC doesn't look for the best person for the job. They look for the best job for the person. And that's really where cadre deployment has wreaked havoc. That we can say from what we have in the documentation. But I think the second point about Ramaphosa and the state capture era is that the fundamental problem is that it should not be up to some secretive committee that sits and decides who gets appointed. That's really the systemic issue. Because at the end of the day, if you are looking for a municipal director on infrastructure, or you're looking for, executives at Eskom or executives in government, the appointment process there should be judged on who is the right person for the job by relevant people who can make informed decisions about that in an interview process, for example. But what on earth does Mr. Ramaphosa or many of these other ANC cadres, Lindiwe Sisulu, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, these are some of the people who served on the deployment committee recently. What on earth do they know about finding the head of, the water and sanitation department's infrastructure division? They are not equipped or qualified to find the right people. And that's the systemic problem, is that you outsource appointment decisions to politicians who openly say that they make their decisions based on political factors like who is a loyal cadre. And inevitably, whether they think someone is right for the job or not, they are not qualified. And they are certainly not legally entitled to make those decisions about positions that should be technical in nature and should be filled by professionals. That's really why we need to move the conversation forward to how we get rid of cadre deployment and how we institute a new selection process where Selection panels are insulated from political interference, where the Public Service Commission plays its rightful job to ensure that appointments are based strictly on merit. And that's the DA's offer in this election as well. We've been very clear. One of our 7 pledges in our manifesto is to abolish cadre deployment and build this new system where professionals will be looking for other professionals to fill these positions.
Now, the ANC's response as a final question is they say, but why is the DA not telling us about its cadre deployment?
Yes, Alec, I'm no psychologist, but I feel a strong urge to diagnose them with a case of projection. In other words, where you try to deflect by accusing other parties of the thing that you are guilty of. I thought it was hilarious when I saw the ANC's statement on yesterday's case this morning, where they said, or they claimed that, they are acting in the interests of transparency and making their things public, and now others must also make their things public. This is the same party who was just held in contempt for hiding this information, claiming to be acting in the interests of transparency. Now, of course, from the DA's point of view, the problem that the ANC has is quite simple. They are asking for things that don't exist. The DA doesn't have a deployment policy. It never has. It doesn't have a cadre deployment committee or anything analogous to that. It never has. And quite obviously, then there would be no records from something that doesn't exist. But I do think South Africans who have been following this, but also South Africans who, live in places like I mentioned Limpopo, where I was recently on the campaign trail, where, people in Hoedspruit or Luittrichardt haven't had water for months, sometimes years. They certainly understand very well every time that they try to open the tap and there's no water, that's the consequences of ANC cadre deployment. It is not on any other party. And in fact, I would maybe end off by saying, if you want to see the difference between a government that is built on cadre deployment, then you should go to Limpopo and try to get water from your tap. But conversely, if you want to understand what can be done in a government that makes appointments on the basis of merit and looks for professional people rather than cadres, and without cadre deployment policies or committees, just come to the Western Cape and experience the difference when you drive from the Eastern Cape into the Western Cape. It's because professional people are maintaining the roads that your car doesn't get stuck in a pothole. It's because professional people are maintaining the water infrastructure, are maintaining, the economic infrastructure that we need to create jobs. That's the reason why 300,000 new jobs in South Africa comes from the Western Cape. In fact, over the last 5 years, 78% of net new jobs have come from this province. And I think that demonstrates to you all you need to know about the difference between a government built on cadre deployment, as in most of the rest of the country, and a government that is interested in finding the right people for the job through a fair, merit-based appointment process.
You have a template. Voters have a template. They can have a look. And it's not just the people who vote with their feet to move to or semigrate to the Western Cape who understand this. It's anybody who just has a look around them. Dr. Leon Schreiber is the Shadow Minister for Public Service and Administration. He's with the Democratic Alliance. I'm Alec Hogg from BizNews.com.